7. Propaganda in Brussels. The Communist League regarded its first task as the organization of associations of German workers which would give it the possibility of public propaganda and from which it could draw the most reliable members for its own extension. The procedure of these associations was the same everywhere. One day in the week was marked down for discussion and another for social intercourse. Libraries were founded everywhere in connection with the associations, and where possible classes were organized to instruct the workers in the elementary principles of communism. This was the plan according to which the German Workers' Association was founded in Brussels at the end of August. The two chairmen of the association were Moses Hess and Wallau, and its secretary was Wilhelm Wolff. The members of the association, who soon numbered over 100, met every Wednesday and Sunday evening. On Wednesdays important questions of interest to the proletariat were discussed, whilst on Sundays Wolff gave a political review of the week, a task at which he very quickly became highly proficient. And after that the gathering became a social one, and women were also present. On the 27th of September this association held an international banquet to demonstrate the fraternal feelings harbored by the workers of each country for the workers of other countries. At the time it was customary to choose banquets as a framework for political propaganda in order to avoid the police interference inevitable at public meetings. However, there was a special purpose behind this particular banquet, which had been arranged by Bornstedt and other dissatisfied elements in the German colony in order, as Engels, who happened to be in Brussels at the time, wrote to Marx, who happened to be absent, to push us into a secondary role as against the Belgian Democrats and to form a much more magnificent and universal organization than our miserable little workers' association. Engels succeeded in foiling this intrigue in good time, and despite his reluctance, on account of the fact that he looked so frightfully young, he was elected one of the two vice-presidents together with the Frenchman Imbert, whilst General Molinet was elected honorary president and the advocate Jotrand acting president. Both had been active fighters in the Belgian Revolution of 1830. 120 guests were present at the banquet, including Belgians, Germans, Swiss, Frenchmen, Poles, Italians and one Russian. After a number of speeches it was decided to found an association of the Friends of Reform in Belgium along the lines of the Fraternal Democrats. Engels was elected to the preparatory committee, but as he was soon afterwards compelled to leave Brussels, he wrote to Jotrand recommending that Marx should be accepted in his stead, pointing out that had Marx been present at the meeting of the 2th of September he would undoubtedly have been elected. It would therefore not be as though Marx were taking my place in the committee, on the contrary, it was I who represented him at the meeting. In fact, when the Democratic Association for the Unification of All Countries finally constituted itself on the 7th and 15th of November, Imbert and Marx were elected vice-presidents whilst Molinet was confirmed as honorary president and Jotrand as acting president. The statutes of the association were signed by Belgian, German, French and Polish Democrats, about 60 names in all. Amongst the Germans who signed were Marx, Moses Hess, Georg Werth, the two Wolffs, Stefan Born, and Bornstedt. The first big meeting organized by the new association was on the 29th of November to celebrate the anniversary of the Polish Revolution. Stefan Born spoke on behalf of the Germans and his remarks were received with great applause. Marx himself was not present, being in London as the official representative of the Democratic Association at a meeting held by the Fraternal Democrats in London on the same day and for the same purpose. The speech he delivered at this latter meeting was couched in a thoroughly proletarian and revolutionary tone. Old Poland has disappeared and we should be the last to wish its resurgence. However, not only old Poland, but old Germany, old France and old England, in fact, the whole of old society is lost. However, the loss of the old society is no loss for those who have nothing to lose in it. And today this is the situation for the great majority of the people in all countries. In the eyes of Marx the victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie would see the delivery of all oppressed nations, as the victory of the English proletariat over the English bourgeoisie would see the victory of all the oppressed over all the oppressors. Poland would be freed not in Poland, but in England. If the Chartists defeated their enemies at home they would have defeated the whole of society. Answering the address which Marx had handed to them on behalf of the Democratic Association, the Fraternal Democrats adopted the same tone. Your representative, our friend and brother Marx, will tell you with what enthusiasm we welcomed his appearance and the reading of your address. All eyes shone with joy, all voices shouted a welcome and all hands stretched out fraternally to your representative. We accept with the liveliest feelings of satisfaction the alliance you have offered us. Our association has existed now for over 2 years with the motto, "All men are brothers." At our last anniversary commemoration we recommended the formation of a democratic congress of all nations, and we are happy to hear that you have publicly made the same proposal. The conspiracy of kings must be answered with a conspiracy of the peoples. We are convinced that we must address ourselves to the real people, to the proletarians, to the men who drip sweat and blood daily under the pressure of the existing social system, if we are to achieve general fraternity. We shall soon see, in fact we can already see, the bearers of fraternity, the chosen knights of humanity, approaching along the same avenue from the cottage, the garret, the plough, the anvil and the factory. The fraternal Democrats then proposed the holding of a General Democratic Congress in Brussels in September, 1848. As a sort of counterblast to the Free Trade Congress which had taken place there in September, 1847. However, Marx had gone to London for other reasons apart from delivering an address to the meeting of the Fraternal Democrats. Immediately after the meeting of the latter to celebrate the anniversary of the Polish Revolution, and in the same rooms, the headquarters of the Communist Workers' Educational Association founded in 1840 by Schapper, Bauer, and Moll. The Second Congress of the Communist League took place to adopt its new statutes definitively and to discuss its new program. Engels was also present at this Congress. He had left Paris and met Marx in Ostend on the 27th of November in order to go with him to England. After a discussion which lasted about 10 days, Marx and Engels were given the task of drawing up the fundamental principles of communism in a public manifesto. In the middle of December, Marx returned to Brussels and Engels to Paris via Brussels. Neither of them seems to have been in any hurry to carry out the task with which they had been entrusted, and on the 24th of January, 1848, the Central Committee of the Communist League sent an energetic warning to the District Committee in Brussels threatening measures against citizen Marx unless the manifesto of the Communist Party, which he had agreed to draw up, was in the hands of the Central Committee by the 1st of February. It is hardly possible to discover now what caused the delay. Perhaps it was the thorough fashion in which Marx was accustomed to carry out everything he undertook. Perhaps it was the separation from Engels, or perhaps the Londoners grew impatient when they heard that Marx was zealously continuing his propaganda in Brussels. On the 9th of January, 1848, Marx delivered a speech on free trade to the Democratic Association. He had intended to deliver this speech to the Free Trade Congress in Brussels, but he had been unable to obtain the floor. He thoroughly exposed the swindle of the free traders who pretended that the welfare of the workmen was the prime motive of their agitation. But although free trade favored the capitalists at the expense of the workers, he recognized that it was in accordance with the fundamental principles of bourgeois political economy. Free trade, he declared, was the freedom of capital, which was engaged in pulling down the national limitations which still hampered it in order to release its full energies. Free trade disintegrated the nations and aggravated the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, thus it accelerated the social revolution. And in this revolutionary sense Marx was in favor of the free trade system. At the same time he defended himself against the suspicion that he harbored protective tendencies, and his plea for free trade involved him in no contradiction with his support of protectionist measures in Germany as progressive bourgeois measures. Like Engels, Marx regarded the whole free trade versus protection question purely from a revolutionary standpoint. The German bourgeoisie needed protective tariffs as a weapon against feudalism and absolutism, as a means to concentrate its forces, to establish free trade on the home market and to develop large-scale industry, which would then sooner or later become dependent on the world market, that is to say, on free trade. His speech was received with lively applause by the members of the Democratic Association, which decided to have it printed and distributed in French and Flemish at its own cost. However, far more important than this speech were the lectures he delivered to the German Workers' Association on wage labor and capital. He proceeded from the assumption that wages were not a share of the worker in the commodity produced by him, but that share of the already existing commodities with which the capitalist purchased a certain amount of productive labor power. The price of labor power, he declared, was determined, like the price of any other commodity, by its costs of production. The costs of production of simple labor power were the costs of providing the worker with the means enabling him to exist and perpetuate his kind. The price of these costs represented wages, and, like the prices of all other commodities, this price was sometimes above and sometimes below the costs of production. according to the vacillations of competition, but within the limits of these vacillations it approximated to a wage minimum. He then examined capital. In reply to the assertion of the bourgeois economists that capital is accumulated labor, he asked, what is a Negro slave? A human being of the colored race. One explanation is as good as the other. A Negro is a Negro, but under certain circumstances he may become a slave. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton, and only under certain circumstances does it become capital. Without these circumstances it is no more capital than gold is money, or sugar the price of sugar. Capital is a social productive relation, a productive relation of bourgeois society. A sum of commodities, of exchange values, becomes capital when it appears as an independent social power, that is to say, as the power of a section of society, and increases itself by exchange with direct living labor power. The existence of a class possessing nothing but its capacity to labor is a necessary condition for the existence of capital. It is only power of accumulated, past, externalized labor over living labor power that makes accumulated labor into capital. Capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor power as a means for further production. It consists in the fact that living labor power serves accumulated labor as a means of maintaining and increasing its exchange value. Capital and labor power mutually condition each other. They produce each other mutually. When the bourgeois economists conclude from this that the interests of the capitalists and the interests of the workers are identical, it is true only in the sense that the worker must starve unless the capitalist employs him, and that capital must perish unless it exploits the worker. The more rapidly productive capital increases, that is to say, the more flourishing industry becomes, the more workers the capitalist needs and the dearer the worker can sell his labor power. The indispensable condition for a tolerable situation of the working class is therefore the speediest possible growth of productive capital. Marx points out that in this case any considerable increase in wages presupposes a still more rapid increase in productive capital. When capital grows then wages may increase also, but all the more rapidly do the profits of capital increase. The material situation of the workers has improved therefore, but at the expense of his social situation. The social chasm between him and the capitalist has grown wider. Therefore, to say that the most favorable condition for wage labor is the speediest possible growth of capital means only that the more rapidly the working class strengthens the hostile power, the alien riches which dominate it, the more favorable will be the conditions under which it is permitted to work anew to increase the power of capital, satisfied with forging the golden chains which drag it along at the heels of the bourgeoisie. However, continues Marx, the growth of capital and the increase of wages are by no means so indissolubly connected as the bourgeois economists contend. It is not true to say that the fatter capital waxes the better will its slave be fed. The growth of productive capital embraces the accumulation and concentration of capital. Its centralization involves a still greater division of labor and a still greater use of machinery. The increased division of labor destroys the special skill of the worker, and when this special skill is replaced with a form of labor which anyone can perform, competition amongst the workers is increased. This competition also becomes stronger the more the division of labor permits one worker to do the work formerly done by three. Machinery produces this result to a still greater degree. The growth of productive capital compels the industrial capitalists to work with increasingly growing means, thereby ruining the smaller industrialists and throwing them into the ranks of the proletariat. Further, as the rate of interest falls in accordance with the accumulation of capital, the smaller capitalists can no longer live on their interest and are compelled to turn to industry for employment, thus increasing the ranks of the proletariat. And finally, the more productive capital grows, the more it is compelled to work for a market whose needs it does not know. Production forges ahead of demand, supply strives to compel demand, and the result is seen in the crises, those industrial earthquakes, more frequent and violent all the time, in which the world of commerce manages to maintain itself only by sacrificing to the dark gods of the underworld a section of its riches, a section of its products, and even a section of the productive forces themselves. Capital not only lives off labor, but, like a noble barbarian chieftain, it drags the corpses of its slaves into the tomb with it, whole hecatombs of workers who perish in its crises. Marx then sums up, if capital grows rapidly, the competition amongst the workers grows still more rapidly, that is to say, the more reduced, comparatively, are the means of occupation and the means of life of the workers. Nevertheless, the speedy growth of capital is the most favorable condition for wage labor. Unfortunately, this fragment is all that remains of the lectures delivered by Marx to the German workers in Brussels, but it is sufficient to show us with what seriousness and what thoroughness he carried on his propaganda. Bakunin was of another opinion. He arrived in Brussels at about this time after having been expelled from France owing to a speech he had delivered on the anniversary of the Polish Revolution. On the 28th of December, 1847, we find him writing to a Russian friend, "Marx is still carrying on the same old vain activities, spoiling the workers by making logic choppers out of them. It's the same old insane theorizing and ungratified self-satisfaction." And in a letter to her about Marx and Engels he was still more savage. In a word, lies and stupidity, stupidity and lies. It is impossible to breathe freely in their company. I keep away from them, and I have told them very definitely that I will not join their communist artisans group and that I refuse to have anything to do with it. These remarks of Bakunin are noteworthy not so much on account of the personal irritation they betray, for Bakunin had judged Marx quite differently on former occasions and was to do so again, but because they reveal an antagonism which was to lead to violent struggles between the two revolutionaries.